G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and this week the Prime Minister came out swinging against red and green tape, promising to speed up development approvals and promising an aggressive deregulation agenda.
Scott Morrison has announced further projects he wants to start sooner rather than...
Today I announce a priority list of 15 major projects that are now on a fast track for approval under a bilateral model. At the Commonwealth level, we fast-tracked approvals for drug trials. Major projects, of course, focusing on Commonwealth approvals, won't do much to deliver. We cut red tape to allow companies to use overseas standards for hand sanitizer. Practical problem, practical solution by practical people.
But it was just a few weeks ago that mining giant Rio Tinto blew up a cave in the Pilbara that showed 46,000 years of continuous human habitation stretching back all the way before the last ice age.
The destruction of these caves has devastated the site's traditional owners, who say they did make repeated attempts and appeals to government, state and federal, to prevent...
Activists have taken their fight to Rio Tinto headquarters over the blasting of a 46,000-year-old heritage site.
Well, despite the loud outcry over Rio Tinto's blasting of the Juukan Caves, the WA government has now approved the destruction of even more ancient Aboriginal sites in the Pilbara region. Just 5 days after the 46,000-year-old rock shelters were reduced to rubble.
Juukan Caves is far, far older than any other more well-known historic icons like the pyramids of Egypt or Machu Picchu, and they were completely irreplaceable. Yet when Rio Tinto blew them up, it was completely legal. So this week we wanted to talk about the importance of regulations as well as consumer and environmental protections, which are often labelled red or green tape by small government types. And today I'm speaking with Executive Director at the Australia Institute, Ben Oquist. G'day, Ben.
G'day, Eb. Lovely to be with you.
So, Ben, this week we've heard a lot from the Prime Minister, and I guess downwards from there, about the need to cut red tape. But firstly, before we, get into the details, does red tape really have anything to do with causing the recession?
Well, as you say, small government types like to suggest that somehow regulation, or what they call red tape in itself, is a handbrake on the economy. There is no evidence of that, of course. But strangely, of course, this recession that we're in was caused by regulation. It's regulation that we all wanted. The COVID restrictions that were put in place, the physical distancing or social distancing, as some put it, bans on funerals for more than 10 people at certain points, football being banned, restaurants being closed. These were all restrictions or regulation that were put in place to protect us, to protect our health and livelihoods and lives in certain circumstances. So in this case, the recession has been brought about by regulation, but it underscores the point that sometimes you want that regulation, and this is a self-induced recession for the health and the benefit of us all.
And we can certainly see international cases without the type of lockdowns and restrictions that Australia put in place early on have led to, in places like the United States, upwards of 100,000 deaths. So certainly consumer protections can be incredibly important.
That's right. And I guess there's a chance that more of us and the public and the political discourse can learn that lesson through this time, because there have never been such a large amount of red tape, if you want to use that word, put in place before. The biggest clampdown on our liberties, our right to do what we want, gather, run a shop if you want, gather for a funeral if you want. The biggest clampdown on those types of liberties, our essential freedoms, has happened under a Liberal government for the benefit of us all. So if you think that regulation is bad or red tape is bad, this is the worst time ever for you. But of course the converse is true, as you're alluding to. Those places that had less regulation, less social distancing, less new rules to protect them, have suffered the consequences. Because Australia did put in place good laws, good regulation to protect us on a scale never seen before in our lifetime under a centre-right government, certainly at federal level, many of us are protected. And I think that's the big potential lesson to come out of this pandemic, is that an understanding that indeed regulation is good for you and is needed, of course, to protect us.
Yeah, so picking up on that point, why do we have regulations in place, and what are some regulations that people might be familiar with that perhaps don't necessarily get thought of in terms of these debates about red tape?
Well, it's big and small in all sorts of ways. Traffic lights, speed limits, right up through to the United Nations system monitoring air traffic control so planes don't run into each other. Regulation is the stuff of civilization, and it really is what protects us and makes our society work. Just as tax is the price we pay to live in a civilised society, laws and regulation provide the guardrails to ensure that people's individual liberty pursuits don't come at the expense of other people's healths and freedoms. And that's the problem with a kind of a banal attack on red tape or green tape as bad in itself. We need laws and regulations. We don't need too many. We need good laws. We don't need bad laws. But to suggest that somehow just getting rid of laws for the sake of it misses the point. We need good laws. We all expect to have good laws, and I think that's the problem with a kind of one-dimensional rant, if you like, against red tape or green tape. It actually doesn't make sense. And one of the things we've all come to understand through this economic crisis is that there's a big role for government in supporting the economy and making it work. Well, similarly, this crisis potentially teaches us that strong government and strong regulations are not red tape or green tape. They are a protection.
And often, I guess, it's not until you notice their absence that it becomes obvious that protection is what regulation offers. So I'm thinking now about, recent very high-profile cases like the Opal Tower residential property in Sydney that's now uninhabitable, and it's taken with it often, the entire fortunes of people who invested in it. Things like Grenfell Tower, where, the building wasn't up to code, and in that hideous fire, people lost their lives. Those are some, pretty intense examples, I guess. But like you said, it goes all the way from, protecting life to, a nice, neat guardrail to protect us all more generally.
Yeah, that's right. Does anybody who was in Grenfell Tower think there should have been less building regulation? Does anybody who has had to deal with the consequences of the Opal Tower fiasco in Sydney think we should have had weaker building codes? No, there's a need for strong regulation to protect people. And anyway, a well-designed regulation provides business with certainty and guidance, and works to ensure that markets serve the broader social purpose. And well-designed rules and regulations create a level playing field and create the certainty for businesses as well as protecting individuals. And I think, again, the lessons from this crisis are that you need strong regulation both through the crisis and potentially afterwards. Like, for example, does anybody think that we should oppose new regulations for cruise ships entering Australia to ensure that the health and safety of not just those on board, but the Australian community are protected in the future? Or there's been some new laws to help regulate and look after homeless people in Australia through the lockdown, so their health is protected and the health of the community. Does anybody think that those things were unnecessary red tape? They were needed to save people's livelihoods. So I do think there can be a new appreciation out of this crisis, that not just the things that the laws we've needed for this crisis were good for us, but in essence, that regulation is at the heart of a civilised, organised society.
I want to move on to green tape more specifically, and it's often argued that green tape gets in the way of development, but in many years in politics, that's certainly never been my experience. I think the Juukan Caves example, where Rio Tinto blew that up entirely legally, and that was tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal heritage and history, and a continuous link with the traditional owners who are still there today. Barely any impediments seem to be in place there, barely any regulations in place that would help those traditional owners to protect that place. Green tape is equally as important. The environmental regulations play a critical role in protecting the environment for everyone as well. What are some of the risks that come with an attempt to remove environmental regulations?
Well, let's just look at the example you've cited, Ebony. It's been reported that since 2010, mining companies have sought to destroy or disturb at least 463 sites in Western Australia. Not a single one of those applications was refused, and now, as a result of that wanton disregard for conservation, we've lost a heritage site that had been protected for tens of thousands of years by the traditional custodians of that land. Really, now following that destruction of 46,000-year-old Indigenous heritage and the sites there, does anyone really think we need less laws, less green tape to protect Indigenous culture and history in Australia? In fact, it's quite remarkable that we're having this debate about green tape just after such an international furore at the result of such important ancient Indigenous heritage in Australia.
And I guess it certainly puts into perspective, some of the debates we're having about protecting statues, that some of which only probably date back decades compared to, 46,000 years of continuous history. It puts it all in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. And that's not to say that there aren't some laws and regulations that we don't need anymore. Good people will inevitably disagree on what makes a good law or whether we need new regulation or not. But it's just that kind of one-dimensional attack on regulation. It distorts our public debate. And how can you argue that we just need to get rid of regulation kind of just for the sake of it, following that kind of destruction? We really need a debate not just about less or more, but the right amount of regulation. And in many places we need more. That's not to say in some places we don't need less.
I was, thinking too about, this particular moment that we find ourselves in now, with an enormous global recession, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. And, reflecting on the last one that we had more recently, the global financial crisis that Australia more or less escaped. But that was caused in many ways by a lack of regulation on the American banking and finance sector, and ended up, impacting on the whole world. Do you think we've learned enough from things like the global financial crisis when we're thinking about how to reform regulations right now?
Well, yes and no, in the sense that, Australia came out of the global financial crisis less punished than some other countries, but we had our own banking scandals. Now, they didn't cause a financial crisis like happened in the United States and that rolled on into the rest of the world. But we have had our own financial scandals and crises, and through the Banking Royal Commission, we learnt that we needed stronger controls on our banking and finance sector. And nobody has come through that and said, well, let's get rid of laws and regulations for the banking sector. There's quite a depth of understanding from the public that we needed more regulation, that leaving banks and finance sector to weak regulators and weak regulation was terrible for consumers, for terrible for the less powerful and less financially literate members of our community. And as you point out, it can be even worse. It can cause financial instability and a global crisis, a global financial crisis and deep recession that many people never recovered from the lack of proper oversight and regulation.
And so that brings us to, I guess, the current debate that we're having now. As Richard Dennis has pointed out previously, and you said just earlier, this recession in large part is because the government made the decision to shut down whole parts of the Australian economy in the service of public health and protecting everyone from coronavirus. And now we're looking at opening up the economy, removing some of those restrictions that have been in place and trying to get the economy to recover out of this recession. But is removing red tape really going to unleash, a massive period of economic growth?
No, even those who believe in deregulation for the sake of an anti-red tape, anti-green tape agenda would have to acknowledge that those kind of reforms take years to flow through the economy. And if you do change regulations and improve them in some places, they can have an effect for the economy, but it's in the long term. In the short term, we're really going to have to do more on the fiscal side and fiscal effort from the government as aggregate demand is weak and international travel is down, and the impact of immigration on population and therefore on our economy. All those things will need massive government support. So if you really want to help the economy in the short and medium term, that's what's going to be required. But even the argument, the RBA Governor Philip Lowe was trying to make a point at a parliamentary hearing the other day, that he's suggesting that the Australian society and culture had limited the dynamism in our economy by putting in place regulation when there was ever a problem. There's no real evidence put forward to demonstrate that. But anyway, regulation that constrains polluters or con artists or cowboys is good for the economy, is good for protecting the consumer, and having those laws in place that, whatever happened to somebody earning an honest living? And of course, regulations and laws put in place mean that people earn an honest living, and the idea that you just rip away a regulation that can maybe help a developer or increase pollution is somehow good for us overall is really short-sighted. In the end, we all depend on a clean natural environment, fair competition, a safe workplace to have a good life, and businesses thrive in those circumstances too.
And certainly regulation helps deliver that. Thanks very much, Ben. We might leave it there.
Thanks, Ebony.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned, and if you can, leave us a review. It helps other people to find the podcast. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au, and this episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 16th of June 2020, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and Ben Oquist is at Ben Oquist. This episode was produced by Lizzie Jack with help from Grace Crivallero. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. Wash those hands, don't go out unless you have to, and thanks for listening.